So good evening and good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies. My name's Jackie Hargreaves, and I'll be chairing this evening's session. It's a great pleasure to welcome both Chris Jain Miller and also Laura von Ostrowski to this evening's panel. It's a wonderful opportunity for me, really, to hear more about Dr. Miller's work. I first met him, I think, in 2014 in LA, where he's residing, actually, or in the past was residing, where he undertook his DPhil at the University of California, Davis. And at that time, I remember him studying quite an unusual topic, which was yoga and surfing in India, which was quite interesting for the time, really, about 10 years ago now, to be studying such a contemporary topic or looking at embodied yoga in the modern world. So Chris is co-founder and vice president of the Academic Affairs and also professor of Jain and Yoga Studies at Arihanta Institute. He's also a visiting researcher at the University of Zurich's Asian Orient Institute and also a visiting professor at the Claremont School of Theology. And tonight we'll be launching his first book, which is quite exciting, called Embodying Transnational Yoga, singing and breathing. So I couldn't find the subtitle there for a moment. Sorry, Chris, but you'll be able to talk us through the subtitle. We also have Laura, who will be the respondent. And Laura, also I've known for a long time, and it's quite exciting to hear her response to this particular text, given she's recently published her open access DPhil, which is called A Text in Motion in 2022. And as a religious scholar, Indologist, and ethnographer, her areas of research include modern and contemporary yoga and the reception history of the Yoga Sutras, including this ascetics and embodiment. She runs a yoga studio in the center of Munich since 2018 and also teaches the history of modern yoga on the online educational portal associated with Hamburg University in Germany. So as mentioned earlier, we'll be running a Q&A. First, we'd like to hear from Chris about his work, and then we'll hear Laura's response. So thank you very much, Chris. It's an honor to have you here. We look forward to hearing from you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jackie, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies for allowing me to launch my book here with you today. The title of my book is, again, Embodying Transnational Yoga, Eating, Singing, and Breathing in Transformation. And I'm very excited to share it with you this evening and to hear from my colleague respondent, Dr. Laura von Ostrowski. Just before I begin, I do have to thank some people because a book is never created in isolation, and it had input from many, many people and sources. And so this is just some of them. Many more are mentioned in my acknowledgement section of the book. I'd like to first of all thank my dissertation committee, Dr. Smriti Srinivas at the University of California at Davis, without whose input and helping me envisioning this book, it would not have come to fruition. So Smriti, thank you. I consider you a lifelong mentor, and I'm really grateful for everything that you gave me as I put my dissertation and then this book together. I also, of course, thank Dr. Amanda Lucia at University of California, Riverside, who also gave me substantive feedback, as well as Joseph Alter, of course, and Flag Miller. I would also like to thank my home institution, Arihanta Institute, and Dr. Parveen Jain, our CEO, without whose support this book would have definitely not happened. So thank you so much, Parveen, for everything that you've given, and the entire Arihanta Institute team. So many of you have been so generous to me over the years. I'd like to thank my faculty colleagues, Dr. Kojin Bohanek and Dr. Jonathan Dickstein, of course, as well as at the University of Zurich. I'd like to thank Nicholas Martin at the ASEAN Orient Institute, who has allowed me to affiliate with the university to complete this research, to bring this book to completion in a very efficient manner. Without your support, it wouldn't have happened so quickly. And I do thank you so much to Dr. Nicholas Martin and all of my colleagues at the ASEAN Orient Institute. Also, my colleagues at Claremont School of Theology, where we have our master's degree in Engaged Jain Studies. Thank you for all your support, as well as to my graduate students, both past and present. You all really inspired me to write this book. A lot of it is for you. It was written inspired by many of the questions that you also asked. So thank you for teaching me. I'd like to also thank my reviewers, of course, Dr. Laura von Ostrowski, who you will hear from in a moment here, as well as Anya Foxon and Krista Kuberry, who gave me significant feedback on some of the initial drafts of the book. At my field sites, I'd like to thank some people in particular. At Yoga Anandashram, the first chapter of the book, Dr. Christopher Chappell, who taught me yoga and introduced me to the yoga of Gurani Anjali. I'm forever grateful. Also to Maureen Shannon Chappell, Glenn James, Kathy Jeremiah, Sal Familia, and Chandani Rodriguez. You were all so generous to me and many more at Yoga Anandashram. And without your help, the first chapter of this book would not have come to completion. At Polestar Gardens, the second chapter, I'd like to thank co-founders Ann Gornick and Michael Gornick, as well as Vina Ketty and the entire community. I really enjoyed, of course, living there with you, and I miss you all very much. And I hope that you will enjoy the chapter about your community. And at Kaivalyadam, finally, chapter 3 of the book, I'd like to thank CEO Subodh Tiwari, Bernard Brito, and Dr. Prasida Menon. You and everyone there were also extremely generous, and without your support, this book would not have come to completion. So with all that being said, let me jump into what the book is about. It begins at the end here. I'll start with the word transformation. What do I mean by transformation? And I was really trying to think about how to start this talk. And a few weeks ago, I was at the UK House of Commons for the launching of a new Jain Studies program, and among other things, with the Institute of Jainology. And when I walked into the UK House of Commons, I had a copy of my book that I had brought to present to our CEO, Dr. Parveen Jain. And on the ground, I saw on this spot, Warren Hastings stood his trial. He was acquitted on all the charges. And I thought to myself, well, if it wasn't for Warren Hastings, this book probably wouldn't exist, or at least it got me thinking about a lot of issues. Warren Hastings, that is, got me thinking about a lot of colonial issues that shaped and formed yoga into what it is today. So I took a selfie with my book, and I took a picture of my book next to Warren Hastings' plaque here on the ground, and I think we'll see why in just a moment. Warren Hastings is, of course, famous for being the one who banished yogins. In 1773, he wrote this: "They, yogins, do the greatest injury to the population and revenue of these provinces. The president therefore recommends it to the consideration of the board to pass a general order to banish them from the country." So here, Warren Hastings is, of course, banishing the yogins who are a threat to colonial power, the ascetic yogi warriors, the sannyasis, vairagis, fakirs, all of these ascetic yogis who are using their yogic powers and their yogic strength to fight against the colonial British. They're banished, and they are not allowed to be in Calcutta anymore. Now, of course, there was an exception to this rule. Devotional yogins, as Warren Hastings showed, could stay. And he wrote in another notice, in notice number 6 that you see here, "Notice is hereby given to all the vairagis and sannyasis, excepting the Ramanandis and the Nats, to leave the town of Calcutta. If any of the above mentioned sects shall be found in Bengal or Bihar, they are to be seized and put on the roads for life, made to work." What is he talking about? Well, of course, the Ramanandis and the Nats were devotional yogins. They weren't yogic ascetic warriors. They were not a challenge to British colonial imperialism, so they were allowed to stay. And this important exception will have a direct impact on what yoga becomes, and the yogas that we inherit. The ones that are legalized by colonial power are the ones that we today take at least a lot of inspiration from. What I mean by this is I'm referring to the work, of course, of Mallinson, who has shown how the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, already in the 15th century, pre-colonial text, was already internalizing tantric kaula practices that were devotional and were intended to have some kind of soteriological experience, and as well as to, of course, improve people's health. Patton Burchett wrote about this in his book, A Genealogy of Devotion, where he identifies, drawing on the work of Mallinson and others, a bhakti sensibility, as you see here, that was already reshaping yoga and tantra in early modern North India that predates British colonial influence. And so there were these internalized devotional forms of yoga found in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and other texts of the Hatha Yoga corpus, for example, that were internalized. They were not external tantric practices. They were not intended to give one necessarily worldly power. They were not necessarily intended to overthrow British imperialism. Those forms of yoga pre-existed, and are coming into the colonial period. And this is where my book really begins and picks up. Because what I'm looking at are these transformative systems that are popularized by the middle class in India and by the middle class Indians in dialogue with Europeans. Sumit Sarkar writes about this when he writes the following: a transition, he identifies, wherein left-handed Tantra was being replaced with, quote, respectable forms of Tantrism by the mystic union of Shakti and Shiva within one's own body through rousing the Kundalini. This, as Sarkar writes, clearly points to a contemporary transition. Tantric traditions were being made more respectable through excisions, and at times sought to be suppressed altogether in Bhadralok circles in the shadow of Victorian norms. So in the face of colonial power, there were only so many yogas, in other words, that could be practiced in India. Some of them had been illegalized by Warren Hastings, whose name I saw on the plaque on the ground in the UK House of Commons. Others were still there, though. There were these internalized devotional forms of yoga that, as Sarkar writes, people like Ramakrishna really democratized the bodily techniques, these transformative bodily techniques of internalized meditation and yoga systems, and disseminated them to the middle class in India, to the Bhadralok in Bengal, but then also even beyond. And these are the systems of yoga that will then go global. Along with these techniques, there were also yoga texts that were popularized, and you might even say canonized during this time, that gained new lives. And my colleagues have written, as you see here, much about this history already. The Yoga Sutra, for example, takes on a life of its own, something new that it had never experienced before. It has become the popularized text of Hatha Yoga, or of postural yoga, I should say, around the world now. But there's a whole history to that. Same with the Bhagavad Gita, and same with this modified Hatha Yoga corpus that is cutting out and excising certain practices that would be seen as kind of nasty or salacious according to European and American sensibilities. These texts, which are seen to be the true texts of yoga through colonial eyes, in conversation with the elite in India, become the corpus that we receive today. For example, you go on the Yoga Alliance website, you'll find that these are the texts and the techniques that are seen to be authoritative and worth undertaking. Now, within all of these new constraints and new opportunities that I've just shown you here, yoga gurus took these resources, the techniques and the texts, and they found windows of opportunity abroad, of course. For example, the Theosophical Society really was thirsty for this knowledge, founded by Westerners, but in dialogue, of course, with their Indian counterparts. Here you have William Kwan Judge, who translated the Yoga Sutra, for example, saying, "Let us then get ready to use the material in the ancient storehouse of India. Treasures that no man can be called a thief for taking, a treasure that is lost by monopoly and expanded by dissemination." So the Theosophical Society thought and saw itself as taking and democratizing and disseminating these ancient truths that could be found in yoga texts and traditions from India, and then bringing them into new worlds of practice abroad. And so what I mean when I say transformation, bring us back to the word transformation here, I refer to it as quote unquote engaged alchemies. And what I mean by that is that something, by alchemy, something is transformed in a mysterious way. And of course, what's transformed is not only the practices as they move around the globe and the techniques, but also the practitioner themselves. And I think anyone who stays around and sticks around to practice yoga long enough knows that yoga has a transformative capacity and power. And that's why people keep coming back and practicing more. There's some kind of transformation that they experience. It may not be the same transformation in any case, but people experience some form of personal transformation. Now, I call these engaged alchemies, and I'm drawing here from the work of Anna Singh, who calls any universal system of knowledge that moves around the planet, moves around the globe, engaged universals. And what she means by this is that any universal knowledge system, yoga, for example, although Singh is not writing about that, yoga, for example, the universal knowledge of yoga or practice of yoga becomes engaged when it moves into a new cultural or historical milieu, right? So there, as Singh writes, there's interconnection across difference. And what that causes is frictions. So what happens is the practices change, the things that we assume to be universal transform in some way, but so too do the practitioners through embracing these practices. So part of what this book is trying to show is how this transformation can still occur and how it occurs as understood by the gurus who are disseminating them, as well as the practitioners, as they move through global society. And that brings me then to the beginning of the title here, Embodying. The title of the book is Embodying Transnational Yoga. What do I mean by embodying? Because we are embodying techniques, as we often hear in transnational yoga discourse. What I mean by this is that yogic bodily practices are, first of all, number one, shaped by their broader social contexts. The way that we eat, the way that we sing, the way that we breathe, the particular practices that we take on, as I'll show in more concrete terms in a moment when I go through each chapter, change as they move through global society. So they're being inspired by the practices and the things that are going on around them, right? That's just the way an academic lens would look at any practice and technique. It's clearly shaped by its broader social and historical contexts, right? But number two, as you see here, the yoga bodies and practitioners and gurus who are harnessing these available practices from their social environments, from their social contexts, to produce, they're doing it to produce a form of embodied transformation. So from an internal emic perspective, they understand themselves to still be undertaking some kind of transformative practice. And so there's an internal cultural logic that I try to bring out in each of these chapters that shows how the practitioners, and particularly, especially the gurus, understood themselves to be exporting practices into the United States, as we'll see. But then there's also the broader logics that they are entering into that I also show from a critical analytical perspective in each chapter. And this brings me then to the practices themselves, and I'll show you what I mean by all of this theory in just a moment. Eating, singing, and breathing. We have to eat certain kinds of food, and so I bring us into food studies in the first chapter, no matter who we are, right? But in yoga, we eat certain ways in different communities. Singing, a lot of kirtan happens in yoga communities, and most probably yoga practitioners have at some point encountered kirtan or a harmonium or something. So there I bring us in chapter 2 into dialogue with the field of ethnomusicology. And finally, 3, breathing. We all have to breathe. We can't stop breathing. And in yoga, we are taught to breathe in particular ways, depending on which yoga community we are practicing in. And so there I bring us into conversation with pollution studies and breath studies, as I'll show you in just a moment. So let's go through each of these chapters and get an idea of what it is I'm trying to do here based on everything I've just told you. Chapter 1 brings us to Long Island, to Yoga Anand Ashram of Gurani Anjali, who you see pictured here. I trained first, as I mentioned before, with Dr. Christopher Chappell, who was trained in this ashram on Long Island, New York. I trained with him in Santa Monica at the Hill Street Yoga and Meditation Center in many of the techniques that he had learned there. I learned a lot about Gurani Anjali's Yoga Anand Ashram, and particularly this is where I was first introduced to the idea of vegetarianism and what it means to practice vegetarianism as an expression of ahimsa in yoga practice, according to the teachings of Patanjali. At Yoga Anand Ashram, the mission of the ashram was to teach the yoga of Patanjali. And that was precisely how they understood themselves, as you'll read in the chapter, to express their ahimsa. They made various commitments to vegetarianism, although not everyone was vegetarian. They made various commitments to vegetarianism as some kind of an expression of that. They opened a vegetarian restaurant, as you see here, Santosha Vegetarian Dining, which you see opening up there. They're putting the sign up. And they also did this within the context of the Bhagavad Gita. So they opened many institutions. They opened a bookshop, they opened an art gallery, they opened the ashram itself, the vegetarian restaurant. And all of these things together, they saw as serving the Bhagavad Gita's notion of karma yoga, of selfless service, because people were serving in the ashram in various capacities on Long Island to provide service to keep it going. Okay, so they were reinterpreting what they were doing through the lens of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, as I began to read into the field of food studies, after spending a lot of time looking through the archives of the ashram, practicing these techniques in California at our 2-year yoga teacher training, reading the teachings of Gurani Anjali, seeing all the menus and pictures that were coming out of here, and interviewing people from the ashram, I started to realize that reading into the field of food studies was very helpful. And what I mean by that is that what I soon realized, everything you see here in green, all of these practices that were taking place, vegetarianism, the restaurant, could be quite easily situated into what is known as the counter cuisine, which was a countercultural food movement that was seeking to help alleviate the violence of environmental pollution from animal agriculture and pesticides, trying to reduce harm on animals through vegetarianism, and all the various things that people were trying to address during the counterculture by simply going vegetarian. And so by reading into the field of food studies, I was able to show the broader context from which Anjali and the ashram were drawing in order to have even the idea to create a vegetarian restaurant and to practice vegetarianism. So on the one hand, what I show is that there's this broader context, but what I show is that there's a yogic understanding of what those practices could be used for. And here it was to achieve self-realization according to the teachings of Patanjali at Yoga Anandashram. Next, I went to Polestar Gardens on the Big Island of Hawaii, a community under the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. And here, among other things, they also had yogic diet and other things they did. But here, a big thing, the main thing was meditation led by kirtan. So kirtan was a way of leading people into meditation, as you can see down here in the ensemble. They're playing all kinds of instruments here on the Big Island. And what they were trying to do, and what they were leading practitioners into doing, was listening to external sacred sound in the form of kirtan, but then that external sacred sound was intended to lead one inward to listen to an internal unstruck sound within oneself in eventually Kriya Yoga meditation for those who were initiated. Now, one of the things I encountered when I was here, as you can see down in the picture below in green, was that they were playing things not only like the harmonium, which we would expect to see in kirtan practice, but also things like the ukulele, as you see, the harp. There are all these instruments that I had never encountered, in particular in kirtan. And I wondered, how is this all coming together? How is it that all of this beautiful music that's being produced in the kirtan at this community can lead one to an experience, or is said to lead one to an experience of an unstruck sound within themselves? So I started to look into the social history and the social lives of the instruments themselves. And as I soon found out, for example, the harmonium, as we know, has a very complicated history. It's an instrument of European origins. It was first patented in France, but then made its way to India with missionaries as a stand-up organ. And what Indians did is they made it their own. They chopped the legs off, they put a hand pump on it, and they made it their own so they could sit on the ground and play it. And then it became eventually what we understood to be some kind of authentic instrument of Indian kirtan, even though it went through this whole social life. It eventually came into the hands of Paramahansa Yogananda, who eventually brought it to America, and now is experiencing it on Hawaii. Now, even more interesting than that was the ukulele. Why are we playing an ukulele to go into meditation? I usually experience playing the ukulele as a form of kind of tropical entertainment. And what I soon realized as I started to read the history of the ukulele, in Trincada and King's book here, the Ukulele, A History, for example, was that it also had a very interesting social life. It is also an instrument of Portuguese, so also European provenance, that eventually made its way with sugarcane workers seeking new work to Hawaii, and then the Hawaiians made the instrument their own. And of course, we often associate it with tropical entertainment, as I said before, but it was also used in political movements, in hula, and now it was being used as an instrument to take us into a meditation on the unstruck sound within. So this is a very interesting colonial history. It's a very interesting history of objects. And what I show is that even though these instruments are rather new, the whole musicological assumptions that are being made can be traced at least back to the 13th century text, the Sangita Ratnakara, which showed that external sound, sacred sound of any kind, could be a bridge and gateway to experience the divine, to experience Brahman, the absolute. And what Yogananda was doing with this was taking this through his own meditative experience with groups like the Radha Swamis, his own training in Kriya Yoga, his own training with instruments, the harmonium and other instruments. He was taking this and he was bringing it to the United States. And the musicology was so flexible that it allowed him to add other instruments here without losing the primary focus, which was that was just a means to then go into an internal meditation on the unstruck sound within. So there's a whole fascinating social life of instruments that this chapter tells, and how it's still said to accomplish these goals in Hawaii today. The third and final chapter then brings us to Kaivalyadam, a very famous yoga institute founded by Swami Kuvalayananda in Maharashtra, in Lonavala, up in the Western Ghats, just outside of Mumbai. Here I show how the institute carries forward and at least century old, but even further back because their teachings come from before the institution, but at least century old pranayama tradition, wherein they are trying to purify the yogic subtle body. Again, there's yogic diet in there and other things, but they're trying to use pranayama as well to purify the nadis, the subtle yogic body, in order to prepare it to perform then an internalized yogic sacrifice. So going back to this internalized system, these are all internalized systems in a way, but they involve these various very material practices like breathing. So they're using these pranayama practices to purify the subtle body through yogic cleansing. They're getting therapeutic benefits from it, but they're also aiming to achieve an internalized embodied sacrifice, which is, of course, sort of part of many yoga traditions. Now, what I was struck by here was that this was being done in, of course, a very polluted region. India, of course, faces a lot of pollution, as you can see here, and pranayama is often proposed to be the solution to these breathing problems. A lot of people came here with asthma problems to the yoga hospital, for example. They're treating asthma from polluted air by doing pranayama in polluted air. So this is really a conundrum that Joseph Alter raised a long time ago. What does it mean to do pranayama, therapeutic pranayama, in urban polluted air? And so in order to understand this conundrum, I took what I was experiencing at Kaivalyadam, which you see they've minted a 100-year anniversary coin in India because this is such an important yoga institution. And they were bringing, what I did is I brought that into conversation with the field of pollution studies. So first of all, just in the New York Times yesterday, you can see there was an article that says, toxic air is no reason to stay inside for Delhi's joggers and yoga fans. Delhi had reached, for example, an AQI of 429, which is absolutely hazardous to one's health. And yet people were still exercising, still doing yoga outside. This is a common phenomena in India, of course, because there's nowhere that people can go. And if you see in this list below from the world's most polluted cities around this same time, early November, in Mumbai, it was the fourth most polluted city. Right outside is Kaivalyadam, where there was an AQI of 178, which is also extremely unhealthy. And what you see in the image there, the NASA image next to that, is what's known as the Asian brown cloud in pollution studies. This cloud takes its name from a cloud in the United States, the Denver brown cloud. There's one that hangs over Denver like this, but it's not as big, of course. But this air pollution that just hangs and lingers and doesn't have anywhere to go, and that is actually becoming a global problem because guess what? It's also not safe to breathe, apparently, in Europe now, as a recent Guardian article showed. It's becoming increasingly dangerous to breathe anywhere, but we all have to breathe, right? So I go into pollution studies then, and I look at the work of Timothy Choi, of other scholars, who implore us to take air as a substance, as something serious to consider in our ethnographic work. So as I'm going into this field site, I'm paying attention to the air quality. What I eventually conclude here is that this is happening within what would be considered a sacrifice zone in pollution studies, a zone in which pollution happens due to all sorts of reasons in the global south, sadly. And I therefore conclude that there are two sacrifices taking place at Kaivalyadam. One is that internalized yogic sacrifice that I mentioned before. And the second sacrifice is a sacrifice that's happening following Mbembe's work on the necropolitical uneven pyre of capitalism, global capitalism. So people's bodies are seen as expendable under global capitalism, and especially in particular regions. So I'm drawing from this work to show how this very kind of tragic situation emerges where people are forced to breathe dirty air all the time, and people like me and who visit and come visit from the West are mobile, able to leave, while other people have to stick around and stay. And so what I show is that people are kind of taking and harnessing the last agency they have in these polluted regions. They're going up to Lonavala, where the air is relatively cleaner, although still at a high AQI of 144, as I show in the book. And they're finding some relief from their burdened lungs in Mumbai and other urban areas in India. So that is really, there's a short conclusion after that in the book that ties things together, but that's really it. I want to thank you all for coming and letting me present. And if you want to learn more, you can go to this QR code, visit us at Arihanta Institute. And I'm also excited to announce that I've talked to Seth Powell at Yogic Studies, who will, with Arihanta Institute, be co-sponsoring a course on the Yogic Studies platform that is about this book, Embodying Transnational Yoga. Stay tuned for an announcement about that. And I will now turn it over for a response from my colleague, Dr. Laura von Ostrowski. Jajanendra, thank you so much.
Hello, and welcome to all of you. And thank you, Chris, for this great summary of your book, which I really enjoyed reading. And I feel very honored to be part of this event and to be able to give the response. Unfortunately, you won't see so many great pictures now as on your slides, just my face, because I'm just having some text about your book. So, Christopher Jain Miller's monograph, Embodying Transnational Yoga, Eating, Singing, and Breathing and Transformation, is an ethnographic study of global transnational contemporary yoga communities. And as the title suggests, the book focuses on eating, singing, and breathing, all practices beyond modern yoga's famous movement practices, asanas. And as the author lets us know right at the beginning, he writes from an academic, yet from a scholar practitioner perspective. This is one of the great merits of the book. As an ethnographic study should, the author takes the yoga communities he investigates seriously. To answer the basic research question of his investigation, namely, to what extent contemporary yoga is more than postures, Miller employs an ethnographic approach informed by, quote, the critical insights from the fields of Indian ocean studies, food studies, ethnomusicology, and pollution studies, which is quite something, Chris. And this helps Miller to, quote, depict how yoga's foodways, musical practices, and breathing techniques have traveled beyond the Indian Ocean rim to become rerouted, altered, and embodied in ways that reflect specific social concerns, contexts, and spiritual aspirations, unquote. So Miller's field of research spans 3 cultural spaces, 3 living yoga communities in the 20th and 21st century, which were all influenced by famous Indian yoga pioneers and by 3 different kinds of somatic practices. In Gurani Anjali's Yoga Ananda Ashram on Long Island, New York, Miller's focus lies on foodways, and Polyster Gardens on the Big Island of Hawaii, which follows the teachings of the famous Paramahamsa Yogananda. The study is centered around music, and Swami Kuvalayanda's Kaivalya Dharma Yoga Institute in Lonavala, Maharashtra, India, gives insights into contemporary yogic breathing regimes and their accompanied difficult environmental circumstances, as you also just heard about. It is these translocations of those pioneers' teachings, somatic practices, as well as worldviews, and their transmutation in said novel cultural contexts, which form the basic research interests of the author. Miller writes, quote, like various forms of engaged Buddhism, promoters and practitioners of transnational yoga make excisions, reformulations, and additions to their yoga systems to adapt to the needs of their contemporary social setting, though they do not understand these changes to tradition to be a betrayal so much as an act of faithfulness to their yoga traditions, unquote. Based on these insights, Miller develops a novel theoretical framework based on Tsing's engaged universals, which he calls engaged alchemies, where alchemy refers to, quote, a power or process that changes or transforms something in a mysterious way, unquote. Based on this, Miller states that, quote, the cultural generative frictions between traveling yoga systems and the novel social context they encounter produced engaged alchemies, unquote. So this framework allows the author, despite the deconstructive work he must pursue, to have a constructive outlook onto modern processes of change in yoga systems and communities. But which elements exactly come together through said processes of cultural transfer and internationalization? And who or what is transformed in a mysterious way? The practices, the traditions, the practitioners? When reading through Miller's examination of his research results, it becomes overtly clear how in the three communities, culturally specific daily life practices like eating, singing, or breathing interact with spiritual, traditional, yet modernized and universalized content, like, for example, the experience of direct perception of the higher self, Pratyaksha. We understand that westernized yet strongly traditional Indians that went westwards, like Gaurani Anjali, knew indeed very well how to deal with different sorts of frictions, to use Miller's term, between the worldly and the otherworldly, the traditional and the modern, the economic and the religious. To pursue the metaphor further, they knew how to use the heat every friction generates to create something new and valuable that still carries the flame of yogic thought within it. Gaurani Anjali, for example, used the popular 1970s American counterculture and counter-cuisine to establish her own modernized take on the ontological and soteriological Sankhya yoga philosophy. She adapted it to the target audience, let's call them American alternatives and spiritual seekers, while at the same time connecting the existing discourses and aspirations of her followers to her own worldviews. Like this, she helped spreading a yogic worldview and the search for transcendent experiences, like perceiving one's higher self, Atman, in an international counter-culturalist milieu. Miller's book also shows how much, like thus, because of these insights, also shows how much modern yoga is shaped by discourses about the extent to which content, practices, and experiences are traditional, universal, culture-specific, or cross-cultural, and how all of those attributes define modern and contemporary yoga. These frictions clearly show that there is an additional factor in contemporary yoga that makes it more than just postures, as we often hear. Exercises of whatever sort are invested with meaning, with philosophical or religious concepts taken from old or medieval India, or even Western philosophy, which are adapted to modernity and put into practice. This practical approach to ancient Indian teachings, which many of you surely know, was already sought by the Theosophists at the end of the 19th century, and which Swami Vivekananda slowly initiated with his book Raja Yoga in 1896, has become a multifaceted reality in today's yoga circles, as also Miller's research shows. It led to something which I called in my own work contemporary yoga philosophy, very much characterized by putting philosophical insights into different sorts of practice. But Miller's book highlights how much not only asana, which was my main focus, something that I could show in my own ethnographic research, but also singing, eating, and breathing are invested with meaning in contemporary yoga land. Gaurani Anjali, for example, understands the work in her Santosha restaurant under difficult conditions as a practical implication of the Bhagavad Gita's practice of karma yoga, or, quote, self-purification, unquote. Thus, for Anjali and her students in this context, the practice of eating deliberately implies so much more than eating. Also, for common practices carried out as polyester gardens in Hawaii, like breathing while internally reciting the Hansa mantra, which are based on Yogananda's teachings and executed by Michael Gornick, Miller summarizes, quote, "In doing so, individuals pneumatically reaffirm the ontological unity between their own higher self, Atman, and the absolute Brahman," unquote. At this point, Miller's work raises and sheds new light on one of the biggest questions of modern yoga. As practices change through cultural transfers and modern circumstances, do the soteriological effects that old yoga texts like the Yoga Sutra or the Gita promise remain the same? This raises some further questions. What does it mean to embody a worldview? Which practices are suitable for the soteriological goal of yoga? Could it be every sort of practice if the intention, for example, is strong enough? If eating American counter cuisine is suitable, could also singing a rock song persistently and with a firm intention of salvation in one's mind lead to said salvation, or does it have to be an old Vedic mantra? Based on these discourses of his research field and his own experience as a scholar practitioner, Miller concludes that, quote, the critical Western academic pursuit of knowledge coupled with yoga's embodied techniques of the body might lead one to the prized biological experience of direct perception of the higher self, unquote. With my own academic background in body research, I would like to add some reflections on the book's take on biology and embodiment, which is reflected in the very first word of the title. When I read actually the subtitle for the first time, I accidentally read eating, singing, and breathing is transformation instead of in transformation. And indeed, from an embodiment perspective, when looking at practices of whatever sort, which are repeated regularly over a longer period, one must expect them to lead to a certain process of changing one's previous embodied form into another one. What I imply with this statement is that repeated techniques of the body, to use the famous expression of sociologist and religious scholar Marcel Mauss, also quoted by Miller in his epigraph, inevitably lead to change, or said otherwise, to a transformation, thus a reformation of the body-mind continuum of the practitioner by building up new implicit body knowledge, for example, new embodied skills. Thus, from an embodiment point of view, regular exercise, be it in āsana practice, be it singing, breathing, or even eating in specific ways or circumstances, is so much more than exercise. Let's take as example breathing practices. Depending on their concrete setup, they will likely lead to building up specific breathing muscles, to a change of muscle tone, which correlates with one's state of mind. They could lead to an activation of the parasympathetic nervous system via prolonged exhalation, and this leads to relaxation. They could help to establish focused attention through increased organ perception, visceroception, which includes an increased attention to the activity of the lungs and can lead to an increased mental focus in general. This small example already shows that to find out what kind of transformation certain practices actually result in would need a special body-oriented methodology. From an embodiment point of view, one needs to expect that when practices change, the effects change. Otherwise, it would be the mental intention behind the practices that is all that counts, not primarily the biology. This would not have been the view of Marcel Mauss, whom we here speak in Miller's epigraph. Quote, I have studied the Sanskrit texts of yoga. I believe precisely that at the bottom of all our mystical states are techniques of the body, which we have not studied, but which were perfectly studied by China and India, even in remote periods. This socio-psychobiological study should be made. I think, and Mauss is speaking, that there are necessarily biological means of entering into communication with God, unquote. What Mauss uttered in 1935 is a very fascinating and topical thought, also raised by Miller. Are there really necessarily biological means of entering into communication with God? Are these then only techniques of the body stemming from ancient India and China, as Mauss puts it, or could it be practices of whatever sort? If we take it seriously that effects change when practices change, this assumption requires further investigation. I would like to end with a research outlook made possible by Miller's broad-based ethnographic, historical, and theoretical work. To find out about actual effects of the practices teachers offer in future research, it might be valuable to include the voices of the students, as based on my own ethnographic experience, one should expect them to differ from the discourses of the teachers, from Gurani Anjali's or Michael Gornick's understandings, as well as their prospections. Such sort of frictions is touched by Miller on page 99, where his investigation at Polyster Gardens show how the students' experiences with the harmonium, which we just heard about, and which was used for a meditative music setting, ranged from delightfulness to rejection. Miller remarks himself on page 105, quote, "Theological and experiential commitments thus varied depending on who one spoke with and were often divergent from the predominant discourse espoused by Polyster's primary Kriya Yoga disseminators," unquote. Interesting questions for further research could thus include: how do students receive the translations from worldview to practice, and how do they implicate them into their own culture and biology-specific minds and bodies? What does, for example, liberation mean to students after having gone through the cleansing processes that Anjali put them through in her kitchen? Did they reframe traumatic experiences in her seva or karma yoga setting, or were they even put into new overwhelming situations they couldn't cope with? Did Anjali's liberation-focused practices have liberative effects? And what does this then precisely mean to the individuals? And did they even lead to spiritual bypassing for some? What does the unity between Atman and Brahman mean to Polyster's students after having followed Yogananda's Raja Yoga framework in Hawaii for a while? And while surely the toxic circumstances in the surrounding of Kaivalya Dharma Yoga Institute due to air pollution should be addressed firstly by politics and aren't solved by the individual alone, it could still be asked if the pranayama practices gave relief to the students despite the circumstances, and what kind of relief then? And do the students follow a bigger soteriological narrative lent from ancient India and modernized to suit novel context, or do they connect these discourses in an individualized way to their own inner processes? Did, for example, the soteriological discourses and the search for samadhi or higher states of consciousness mainly helped some American students to overcome their drug addictions while searching for a drug-free high, or as one resident at Polyster uttered, "Since we can't do drugs here, we sing and meditate." And if the students' experiences and interpretations differed from the prospects of the teachers, does this mean that they were not, quote, initiated into the more secretive practices, as Miller suggests on page 108, or could this also mean that the cultural frictions produced something different with differing goals and effects? Miller's book provides an important historical and analytical basis for such broader questions, which are of extreme importance for the future field of yoga studies, which is concerned precisely with all such processes of adaptation and reception. Thus, to sum up, the book shows fairly well that while Indian practices as well as discourses were interpreted and refashioned by Indian teachers in the 20th century into a big tasty concoction, there is nevertheless still one big red line that spans over time, despite the fact that practices and circumstances change, were simplified, democratized, and commodified. It is the soteriological aim behind all of the food, musical, and breathing practices Miller investigated, as mundane as these practices might seem. And while it is a strength of this book that it takes these soteriological claims of modern and contemporary yoga systems seriously, it obviously goes beyond an academic investigation to prove them. But with Miller's book, those topics are expressed in a very clear manner, and surely yoga studies as well as yoga communities will revolve around them in the coming years. Miller tells us in his preface about the supernatural stories his Filipino grandmother told him that enchanted him as a child. And also his book, despite being academic, leaves space for things that we don't know yet. And that's a big strength of that book, and in my view, a magic that the book unravels is primarily a magic that emerges from context and frictions between humans, their bodies, their practices, and their worldviews. So Chris, congratulations again to your achievement. I'm very grateful that this book is part of modern yoga studies from now on, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with you and then with all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Laura, so much for taking the time. First of all, I just want to say that it means a lot to any scholar, I think, when someone reads their work so closely, and especially someone as qualified as you to do that. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate your summary and analysis and questions that you've raised here. I know we've talked about the book and we've talked about things many times, but I think you really summed it up well, and you did ask some very important questions that, yeah, we can start to have a dialogue about right now. And for those who don't know, Laura has already published a book, Ein Text in Bewegung, a text in movement. It's in German. I keep saying let's make it in English, but because there you have it. Yes, Ein Text in Bewegung. The reason I asked Laura to do the review was because Laura does study embodiment, and because I have embodiment in here so much, I knew that you would respond the way that you did, and I really appreciate it so much. So maybe I'll start by just responding to some of the questions. We can go back and forth, unless Jackie has another plan. This would be fine for me, to kind of, yeah, just make our way through, and then after we can take questions from the audience. One thing I forgot to say in my presentation, and I'm happy you brought this up, Laura, is that my book also speaks to not only the other fields that I mentioned, but also to the field of Indian Ocean studies, because I'm looking from a research consortium that I was in at the University of California, Davis, Reimagining Indian Ocean Worlds, that looks at the way that the boundaries of the Indian Ocean have been passed and pushed beyond the Indian Ocean itself. So I'm showing how yoga moves outward from India, and these ideas from the Indian Ocean have spread and become now global in these other coastal sites, so to speak. So thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to say that. Let me just begin by responding by saying that I guess one of my expressed methodological intents here, and I think this is something that you point out quite well by saying, like, you want to hear more practitioner voices, right? And I think that that's a valid question to look for more of the practitioners' voices here. And I hope that this study will open doors for us to be able to do more ethnography in that manner. In this book, what I was trying to do as I was reading in the field of modern yoga studies in grad school was to start from the perspective of what Van der Veer calls an interactional perspective, which means I basically wanted to balance out the way that yoga disseminators, these yoga gurus, understood their soteriological systems themselves as they took them abroad. To see, I can't speak for them, but having practiced within these systems myself as a scholar practitioner, I wanted to show what they thought they were doing, so to speak. What were their intentions with these bodily practices? And so in some ways, you know, I think in each chapter I've included some of the counter voices, and I invoke like Bakhtin's heteroglossia to kind of say that there's a lot of voices in this story. There isn't just one yoga system that works one way and it's clean and there's no messiness. There's actually a lot of messiness, right? So I think it could have been helpful, as you're saying, to maybe include more of those quotes of people saying like how can you practice pranayama here? It's so filthy. Or how can you listen to the harmonium? Or and in the first chapter with regard to food, one thing I didn't mention, and it's in the chapter though, is that, you know, not everybody was vegetarian. And they expressed that to me at Yogananda Ashram, or sometimes they practice vegetarianism as a form of like tapas or yoga or whatever, but they didn't do it all the time, right? So I guess what I'm trying to show and balance in this book, and it invites, as you say, and I'd like to hear what you think about this if you want to say anything else about it, but it invites a conversation about developing further methods of going in, as you have, into a yoga community and listening to the reception on the receiver side a little bit more carefully. But in fact, I was kind of trying to avoid that a little bit in this book, because I felt like the Western reception story of yoga, especially in America, has been told. There's much more to be said, but I wanted to show what might the guru's perspective have been going in, and how did they adapt these practices, these transformative practices. But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that, but that was my first thought.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would have never expected that with what you did already in these three fields to have much more interviews going on. This is quite a different, I interviewed teachers and students, and this is quite a different level of interpretation that you need to do then. So it would have surely completely, let's say, how does one say it in English, like expanded your possibilities. And what you're saying there is, I think, very valid, because when we heard about, or we worked for a long time with Elizabeth de Michelis' modern postural yoga theoretical framework, and it somehow excluded it said it is physical practices, but without much soteriological background or soteriological, let's say, plus. So it's just the bodily practices, and she enlists Ashtanga yoga, Iyengar yoga, and others. And actually, the Indian teachers themselves, they did not think so, even if it might have coming when it comes to asana practice been understood like that in the reception history and then in Western context, very much so. But as I also show in my Ashtanga yoga field that I did research in, this is just not the case. Also, the asana practices were for the practitioners pretty much more than their asana practices. And I wanted also to investigate what is the more, what do they tell me is the more, but then also what could one how could one look at the practice? What do they do with the practitioner? So I think that's a very valid point and a very good, kind of a framework you took there to really look at how did the Indian teachers, what did they want to transmit with their systems? So thank you.
No, thank you. I agree, and I think when it gets received into the students' hands, it goes in all different directions, right? And as you said, some of them were initiated, and so some of them followed the script pretty closely. Those were the really dedicated, initiated people at most any of the places I went to, or who were really practicing a lot. But then there were all these side narratives about this, that, and the other thing that you could write another book about, for sure. And I suppose something I could have been more explicit about in this book is that I'm also trying to write some social history here. I'm not a historian, but I'm really interested in the way that the past is affecting the present. And so when you read through it, you notice there's a lot of social history from secondary literature telling a story about what's happening in the broader landscape, and then being received. So I thought your question about intention was also it's related to this, and I think it's really a good question, because is it the practice itself that's transforming the person, is what I'm hearing you ask? Or is it the intention behind the practice that's actually transforming someone? And one of the limitations that I wrote right up front, of course, is that I'm not in a position to say how these practices are changing the body. Someone else will do that. Pranayama, for example, is a good example. They do Tessa Kaivalyadam all the time. I can't do that stuff. So that's something that I don't get into in the book. But the question of intention, I think, is important, and it would require more close study of the student's intentions or a guru's intentions in a particular context. And when you said the thing about listening or singing heavy metal, I can't remember what it was, can that lead you to some kind of soteriological or whatever experience? And my answer would be, it depends. But also, I know somewhere, I think I might have cited this in a footnote, there's Krishna core, right? There's these Krishna devotees who practice like punk. And they see their practice as you could say liberating, or part of their soteriological practice, this Krishna core, even though there's no Vedic mantra per se involved. I mean, they may be reciting at some point, but these hardcore, so of course, I think anyone can, but then it also depends on what you said after that, I think, which is that when practices change, the effects change. And of course, that's totally true. One thing I thought of about that particular topic was with regard to yogic diet. So Swami Prabhupada, so we'll keep talking about Krishna, when he came to America, some of the stuff I was reading in food studies and in religious studies, he brought his Bengali food with him, right? He wanted to reproduce that in America as best as he could. So his diet was vegetarian and Bengali food, mostly, I guess you could say, even though he moved to America. So maybe whatever transformations meant to happen through that Bengali food and whoever ate it all the time with him could stay the same or relatively the same, right? Whatever principles it has been based on and when it was being prepared. But Anjali, interestingly, in her chapter, she's coming from Bengal, and she doesn't bring her food with her. I mean, of course, I'm sure she cooked Bengali food, but the restaurant was eating American counter cuisine, vegetarian mostly. And that was supposed to accomplish something. So I guess the thing that those two share, this is just food for thought, I'd like to hear more of your thoughts, is that they've both given up meat, right? So there's some biological effect of not eating meat. I can't say what it is, but I'm just saying that if you practice something for a very long period of time, it will have some effect on you. They share that in that regard. But yeah, I don't know if you have further thoughts about the effects change when the practices change or the food changes.
Well, I haven't done research on the practices that you investigated. It's just let's say a basic assumption of body knowledge theories. But what I find interesting, I mean, there are many things that I could add or that fascinate me about that topic. Just for my own research field, what I did, for example, and it was just a try as a cultural studies researcher, religious studies researcher, and focused on embodiment from an aesthetics of religion perspective. Like my professor developed a framework for researching practices from an embodied point of view by developing body knowledge categories. And so what I try to do, for example, is to look at the narratives that we find in Ashtanga yoga, that certain practices are Ashtanga yoga, the higher limbs, that, for example, Tristana, which actually seems to be a practice coming up very late in the Joyce in the Ashtanga yoga lineage. So we hear about Tristana not in Krishnamachaya's books, not in Joyce Yogamala, but pretty late, and now it's a pretty common feature in Ashtanga yoga. So what you said about your research field, that a lot of change was there, is in Ashtanga yoga the same thing. Tristana means that if you put into your asana practice drishti, that means your eyes are fixed, and you have asana or bandha, sometimes these two are exchanged. And the third is ujjayi, like breath. And if you have this is the asana practice. If all of this merges together, is becoming a meditative practice. Yeah. So, and when one practices it is pretty absorbed. Yeah. But when I did really research on that, I had to find an ethic view on that means a descriptive language on what is happening there on a body level. And then I looked at studies, and I came to flow experiences, I came to focused attention, to open monitoring. It's all like common knowledge in studies that this is what comes out of, and not only in Ashtanga yoga practice, but different modern yoga practices, which means there is a high focus, there is a high concentration, maybe even an absorbed state like a flow state, but it might not mean that you have a samadhi state as Patanjali talks about, or it might not mean that you even have a dhyana state that Patanjali talks about, like honey is flowing and there's no disruption anymore of because when you are on the mat, you might still smell the sweat from the person on the mat next to you, and so on. So I mean, it is meticulous work, and I'm not sure where this could lead us, but it can prevent to have these discourses. I mean, I interviewed yoga teachers that they didn't tell me like explicitly, but what I heard out of what they told me is that they are enlightened. So they are a Jivan Mukti. And when these discourses are just floating around, and every kind of practice could have this and that effect, it could also be dangerous. People can just think that this is that, or think that. And so this is, I think, something that us as researchers, we have to just look at, or just be careful in how we express things, or and still taking seriously the emic perspective, still taking seriously what yoga teachers and gurus with also their tradition behind them said. So yeah, I'm wondering what you are having to add.
No, totally. I'm starting to think about sitting in like graduate seminars and poring over the question of tradition versus science, religion versus science, because whatever you want to call it, yoga versus science, Jainism and science, they don't always, you can't always reconcile these worldviews. And science tells us some pretty powerful things, especially about embodied practices. As you know from your book with āsana and with pranayama, for example, it can tell us things about these practices, and it does. And there's studies out there that I'm not citing in my book. But you could also, I guess, apply that method to really trying to understand a particular yogic diet in a particular place and measure its effects, which places like Kaivalya try to do. But it would take a real, I think, a hardcore scientific method to be able to do that. And so it's a question I can't get to in this book. I'm using a total cultural perspective of what did they think was happening without saying what's happening, right? But I think your point is an important one, because we don't want people to do what you said earlier in your talk, and I agree with you. Was there some spiritual bypassing going on? I mean, there is in every spiritual community, right? Varying degrees of spiritual bypass. And a lot of times that spiritual bypass, as we've recently seen with like conspirituality and all that kind of work, conflicts so directly with science that it becomes dangerous, right? And so, yeah, I agree with you. And I think when I get to chapter 3 in the book, and I'm studying air pollution, I think that highlights your point really well, because the practice isn't changing. They're doing the same pranayamas, basically, that they've been doing for 100 years and even longer, like Kaivalya even before that, right? So the pranayamas in the purifying practices, the Shat Kriyas from like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, alternate nostril breathing. This is all relatively remain the same, whatever, but what's changed is the air itself, right? And so not only did the practice remain the same in that case, but the air changed. And so now we have to pay really careful attention to the air. As the New York Times showed us yesterday, people are still refusing to stop doing pranayama in Lodi Park in Delhi because they still think it has some beneficial effect, some of them. And some of them just feel trapped, right? And they can't get out, and it's very sad. And so I kind of lament that, I guess, in the book, and try to like introduce the science, as you're saying, as far as I could find it in air in pollution studies. There's more stuff developed there that I could draw from to kind of put this red flag up to say, like, doing pranayama in polluted air is not safe, right? And the last thing I'll add with that is that I just found out, I was reading in The Guardian recently, that the air basically all over Europe has been scientifically shown to be dangerous. We're all breathing dangerous air in Europe right now, and in the US there's all these loopholes that are causing it to be even worse, and people are breathing polluted air too. So I get invitations, like you probably do, to go to like breath workshops all the time. And now I think, like, do I want to do that breath workshop and be deeply inhaling air in the center of Zurich? Do I? When I know scientifically that the air is not that great. So anyways, you just got me thinking about those things as I was going through this. But I think these are important questions that point to your main point, which is that we have to be careful with the spiritual bypass. Anyone, if you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed your critical outlook, especially in that chapter, but also generally, it's very important, and makes me think of bathing in the Ganga. It's kind of a similar thing. Also, the question, like, is the intention enough to kind of bear what this, if you drink that water, to not be affected by that biologically, yeah. So yeah, I think I don't know if I want to add anything. I think that was just a good point that you made, and yeah, it's just, yeah, no, I don't want to add anything.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciated your questions and
Thank
feedback.
you, Chris.
So thank you both, Chris and Laura, for your insightful review of this new research. And firstly, Chris, I would like to say, the book really does take the field forward in terms of no longer, being restricted to the analysis of contemporary yoga being that purely of postural practice, and looking at these other aspects which people have within other cultural contexts, such as America, are really taken quite seriously. So in the past, the idea of breath practice or singing or changing one's diet, particularly in what we'd call the New World, America, Australia, and those sorts of things, people have really taken these other alternative ways quite seriously. I had one question before we open the floor, because we have already received quite a few questions. But my question to you is, you looked specifically at, you mentioned in the beginning of your talk about moving from sort of outside of India back into India in your analysis, particularly of transnational yoga. But then my question is, then in the third chapter of your book, which you look specifically at breathing, you chose to be centered in an institution within India. And how do you reconcile this in your idea of it being transnational yoga? I understand that, of course, Kaivalya Dharma is a 100-year-old institution, and many people have been going there for many years to practice. But you chose specifically for the breathing, could have been possible to do something within America, or Europe, but you chose an Indian institution, and this is in contrast to your other case studies. So that was my brief question, and then we can hand over to the floor.
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I was developing even my PhD project with my professor, Smriti Srinivas, my supervisor at UC Davis, she and some other people thought it was interesting that, look, here's this guy who started practicing yoga. I mean, I came in just as a practitioner. I did not have a critical analytical framework at all. And here's this guy, she says, here's the surfer guy that walks into me and is like, I want to study yoga. And I'm like, okay. So she said, instead of starting in India with your ethnography, as can happen in almost any story of yoga, it starts in India, then it goes abroad, right? She said, why don't you just start where you are? You started practicing at the Hill Street Yoga and Meditation Center with Chris Chappell, which was based on Yogananda Ashram in Long Island. Start there, look at that community and what they're doing. And the biggest thing we did there, of course, was food. So I was like, okay, I'll start there. And then I went to Hawaii while I was in graduate school and discovered Polestar and had a wonderful time in the community, went there. And then, she said, okay, now go to India and see what happens, reverse the script. And so the whole thing from the beginning was to reverse the script of the way that the story is told. So I try to start with the reception of yoga in the United States and then end in India instead of starting there. And I think what makes it transnational, and I thought about this a lot, and it didn't really come together for me until when I was there, right before I was going to write the chapter, and I was trying to find the proper analytical framework to go through with it. I contacted Timothy Choi in pollution studies at UC Davis, who sent me an article about air, because I was talking about pollution already in my dissertation. And he said, why don't, you should pay attention to air as a substance. And really, so I started looking at air pollution in India. And what I realized and what I write about in the chapter is that India is so polluted because of this kind of neo-colonial, neoliberal system that makes it necessary for India's economy to thrive. It has to burn unclean energy. There's all these transnational influences, I guess you can say, capitalistic influences that make it transnational. It's the air itself as a substance and what's happened to the air and how that's connected to what's happening on the ground that for me made it transnational. So anyways, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely.
These practices continue, at Kaivalya. By the way, I wanted to mention that I healed my back at Kaivalya. I had a terrible back injury when I was in Hawaii. I could barely walk. And I went to Kaivalya and, amidst all that field work and everything I was doing, they helped me heal my back. So they have an incredible yoga hospital there, I should mention.
Indeed, yes, and a living tradition, really, which is quite extraordinary. So thank you very much, both of you, for your insights into this particular research. I'd like to open the floor here. We have a few questions online, and I'll start with Wendy's. The idea with the questions is, because we're a webinar, I'll read out the question and then you can respond, Chris or Laura. So from Wendy, we have, thank you both. And Christopher, you mentioned kirtan and mantra. Is there any reason why Vedic chant was not a significant consideration for the sound portion of your book?
Yeah, Wendy, that's a really good question. So it was at first. I did have drawing from secondary literature, such as Vilke and Moibos, who wrote a really comprehensive book on sound and communication in Hinduism, as they call it. From Guy Beck, from a number of people who are in ethnomusicology and allied fields of inquiry who wrote about Vedic mantra and chant and things like this. I did have a bit of a genealogy of how I was showing the development of that before it gets into the 13th century. When the book was being edited, a number of people said this is too much for this book because of what the book's focus was, which was a cultural study. But I held on to that 13th century piece because it was so directly connected to what Paramahansa Yogananda was doing. And that 13th century piece, Sangita Ratnakara, that I mentioned by Shangadeva, that Sanskrit text can be traced to some of these earlier traditions that you're referring to. So to answer your question, it's an important one. And they didn't want me to include it. A lot of people said you should take this out because it's too much for what you're trying to do. The chapter would have been way too long. But yeah, I appreciate your question. And it's not that I don't mention it because, Yogananda was using Sanskrit chants and mantras in his work that I mentioned there. And I refer you out, like there are a lot of bibliographic resources if you want to learn more about it that do discuss that directly. So thank you so much, Wendy.
Move along to Raj's question. He's got a few here, so we might take two from Raj and then I'll move ahead and then we'll come back if we have time. So Raj's first question is the Western commercialized concept of yoga a challenge to your mission? And if so, how can we minimize that narrative?
Yeah, so I'll read it once again for my own to understand. So is the Western commercialized concept of yoga a challenge to your mission? And if so, can we minimize that? So I don't know what my mission is except to educate. And I actually think that the commercialization concept, it's been covered by other colleagues of mine. Andrea Jain, for example, talks a lot about yoga and capitalism and things like that. And I think it's an important conversation to have because what people like Andrea Jain have shown is that yoga is not separate from capitalism. It never was, and nowhere in the world really is it, unless you're like, a sadhu who's like totally surviving on your own off in the middle of nowhere. Even the sadhus in India are connected to capitalism because they're eating food that's produced within capitalistic systems. And so I think rather than wondering if it kind of compromises yoga and teaching yoga, what yoga has shown me, at least in my study of yoga and practice of yoga, is maybe a better way to be within capitalism without getting completely overwhelmed by it, which is very hard these days, as we know. As you see my surfboard standing behind me here. I don't know if maybe Laura wanted to answer that question too. Do you have thoughts on that or?
No, I think you answered that well. I just came up with another question, but I will put that at the end. Thanks.
We'll come back to another of Raj's questions, but we'll skip ahead to Amelia. And this, I think, touches a little bit on what you spoke to me about, but perhaps there's something more you'd like to say. And it is, how did you choose the 3 locations? How do you define transnational?
Yeah, so Amelia, it's a good question. And I often tell people, like when they ask me, like, what fields do I work in? I say that I'm a theologian who was then raised by a pack of anthropologists, which is really true because I studied theology and comparative theology when I started practicing yoga before, right? And I got really into yoga at the first location, Yoga Anand Ashram. But I didn't quite have a critical analytical framework that I could apply to that at the time. I found the practices to be extremely transformative of myself and just the way that I viewed the world and the way that I was in the world. I just benefited so much from it. And that was, along with the teachings of Guru Anjali and at Hill Street Yoga and Meditation Center with Chris Chappell, when I was working in Los Angeles at Yoga Glow, which is now Glow, many of you know glow.com. And I just being immersed in that community, it just inspired me so much. I never let go. There's still things from that community that I hold on to. And so, like I said, when I was in my PhD program, trying to figure out what to do, and I was talking to my advisor and other people within the program, they're basically like, just start where you are in terms of your field site. You don't have to invent something new. And that's when I started with Yoga Anand Ashram. And then I went to Hawaii where I had lived before. I knew about Polestar Gardens there because I had lived and worked there as a CPA in the past. And so I knew these people, the community. And so I went to live there just because it was something that I was connected with. And I think being an ethnographer and when you're doing field work, you have to have pre-established connections or really set yourself within a community for them to be able to trust you and to gain their confidence. And so I remember I was at Polestar Gardens and I said to Michael Gornick, the co-founder, I said, I really want to write a chapter about you guys someday. Can I do that? And he said, yeah. And so here it is, like, you know, that's in 2017. And I said that to him. But that's how that happened. And then India, actually, this is a good question about India. I was going to go to ICYER, the International Center for Yoga Education and Research in Pondicherry, which is also a nice yoga therapy place. I was signed up to go do their yoga teacher training as my third site. I busted my back so bad in Hawaii playing volleyball that I couldn't go. I was disqualified. You had to be in good health to be able to do the training, understandably. So then I thought, what am I going to do? I started talking to people. I talked to Chris Chappell, and then I talked to Rachel Hammerline. Some of you may know Rachel. And they said, why don't you go to Lonavala, go to Kaivalyadam, do some yoga therapy. And, you know, and that's how I ended up choosing to go to Kaivalyadam. So in some ways, sometimes it's daiva, it's destiny and these things that drive us to these locations. Now, in terms of it being transnational, what I mean by that is that the yoga has transcended the nation state. And I write about this a bit in my introduction, where, especially when I'm talking about Indian Ocean studies, that the yogas that are being practiced by people, similar or same systems across national borders. So national borders don't define this yoga. And I try to really get away from, I don't ignore it, but I get away from looking at yoga as a nationalist thing, which of course we know in some places it's being practiced that way. But even if you were to go in and do an ethnography, which I did a little bit of ethnography on nationalism while I was in India, people, as Laura was saying, when I got down to talking to people one-on-one, they're like, I really don't like this national yoga thing. This is how we do yoga here, you know? So I experienced that a lot. And so that's what I mean by transnational. Yoga transcends the nation state, even though it's clearly produced by, in some ways, and shaped by people down on the ground are shaping it in their own ways at the same time.
Thank you, Chris. To follow on from that, I'll skip ahead to the final question here by Stefanie Kremerer. And Stefanie, she asks, why did you choose the term transnational? It's sort of following on from your most recent discussion, and hopefully perhaps you can answer this one. So why did you choose the term transnational when discussing these traveling and transformative practices as compared to, for example, transcultural?
Yeah, I think I really focused on transnational from the start in discussion with my dissertation advisor, and this is so my dissertation also had transnational in it as well. And I think a big part of that, maybe consciously and subconsciously, more consciously as time went on, is that I had been writing about nationalistic yoga in India, publishing about that for quite some time. Some of my previous publications talk about like the International Day of Yoga, for example, and I'm really discussing the politics of yoga. And I don't want to steer away from that, but I wanted us to see yoga as something that went beyond the nation state. And I'm drawing specifically in the introduction again from like Indian Ocean Studies. They had a recent I think it was Gastronomica, I can't remember which journal it was in food studies, did a special issue on Indian Ocean foodways to show that the foodways in the Indian Ocean don't come from one particular nation state, but they're shaped in the frictions, basically, in the entanglements between multiple, what we would call nation states, multiple geographies, and they transcend these geographies so much so that they're no longer national, what we call national dishes have been forged and created with multiple cultural influences. So yeah, I guess I could have used transcultural as well, but I didn't make a conscious decision not to. But I know that I wanted to show in this book that yoga goes beyond the nation state. That's for sure. So that's a big part of it.
Thank you. We'll go back to one question from Raj, and here the second one down says, what are your thoughts on the works of other esteemed academics in the field of transnational yoga, such as Kelfinger and Bartos? And perhaps, Laura, you have some response to that as well.
Yeah, Laura, did you want to answer that at all? Or
I actually don't even know them. I'm sorry.
No worries. So I just don't want to dominate the conversation. But so I've looked at Klepinger's work. Laura Kleppinger, I think, is who you're referring to. Transnational Yoga at Work, I believe, is the title of the book. Bartos, I can't remember exactly. I know the name, but in terms of Klepinger's work, I think it's going in the right direction, and I think it's fantastic. I actually cite it in my book. Looking at this is a question I had going into the field that I didn't get to answer maybe as closely as I wanted to because I didn't focus on it. But when you talk about transnational yoga at work and you talk about labor practices, as Kleppinger does, that occur in different Shivananda yoga ashrams, which is the topic of that book, if I'm referring to the same book that you're referring to, I think it's really important. And I did this a little bit at Kaivalyadam, and I did it a little bit at Grani Anjali's ashram, to know who's doing the work, who's getting paid or not paid for the work, why are they either getting paid or accepting not to get paid for their work. Does it have to do with spiritual reasons? Karma yoga, as we would say, like, which is normally interpreted in the West, is just doing selfless service without getting paid, maybe, which we had these programs also at Polestar where you go, you pay to work basically, but you get to stay in Hawaii. So it's nice, right? But I think these are important questions about labor, capital, and class that Kleppinger raises. And it's different at different field sites depending where you go. So it's a really interesting question to ask of who's doing the work, where, and when. And yeah, like I cited that in one of my chapters, in the Anjali chapter, actually. Thanks for the question. I'll check out Bartos now too.
Excellent. So we have another one from Amelia, and Amelia says, you mentioned that when you started, you didn't have a critical perspective on yoga. How do you think that that's changed and evolved through your research and then impacted your practice and work?
We can probably both answer this. You can go ahead first if you want. Do you want to?
Well, it's your book launch. I'm happy to hear you talk, actually. But yeah, I think because I did also already my master's degree on yoga, not really yoga communities, but I started to somehow observe and read Singleton and so on. And I think actually the literature of yoga scholars that was already done helped me a lot to get a different view on what is happening in the field. And then, but it is a difficult, let's say, how do you say, bridge? No, thing to balance in oneself, to somehow, when you go in the field as an ethnographer, to not just be critical, but also to look at what you're finding, but then still stay critical. This is a constant back and forth somehow. It was, at least for me. And I don't know how your experience was starting in there, like having, but you have read also, I guess, the literature of yoga scholars before you went in the field at some, no?
I certainly did, yes. So I think it kind of evolved like you're describing, Laura, but I remember being in graduate school and Tracy T. Meyer, who I believe is here, thank you for coming, one of my professors and mentors, gave me Said's book, Orientalism. And I thought Said's last name was Said at the time. That's how educated I was, right? So I went through this and I went, oh my gosh, I didn't know what Orientalism was. And that opened my eyes. And that was at the very end of my master's degree. Got me thinking to look into this more, different kinds of Orientalism, romantic Orientalism, colonial Orientalism. And then I eventually read Mark Singleton's book when I was applying to do my PhD. So I started to read a little bit more of the critical stuff that was out at the time. We're talking 2013, right? So there's not a ton of stuff out then, but there's some stuff out there. And it showed me like, wow, there's all this amazing critical scholarship. And somehow I thought that I was practicing at the time, like the yoga. I still thought that like, oh yeah, Mark Singleton's talking about asanas, but I'm like vegetarian and I'm doing everything, you know? And I certainly had powerful experiences practicing yoga. I'm not going to lie. And I think that's what keeps most people coming back. And that's why I still practice yoga. But at the same time, you cannot deny when you're not even if you're anywhere, right? You cannot deny the social realities that are taking place all around you. And those things often seem to call into question what you thought was true. And yet there's something so powerful and transformative about the practice that baby in the bathwater, I was never able to talk. I've been cradling that baby in the bathwater, even though academia has made me slowly with a syringe take out some of the bathwater and get rid of it, to understand like what's worth holding on to here. And I try to express in the book that there's a lot of stuff we have to critique. There's so much going on in these communities, as Laura also talks about, right? In your own work, there's so much stuff that's just not true or harmful or whatever in yoga communities worldwide. But there's also a lot of great things. There's a lot of great social experience, and also a lot of people have some kind of powerful meditation experiences, right? So it's to me, that's kind of undeniable, and I don't want to lose that fact, even though it's difficult to take in difficult social facts. Right.
Can I add something? I think it, like when I gave last course, I gave a history of modern yoga. Someone said, like, now that I know what happened in that time, I think it was in the 18th century in India, in what kind of circumstances there were in that time with colonization and so on, it just explains so much to me. And before it was just floating around with my own experiences and everything. And I didn't have all like this context of everything. And it just helps also so much to have that context, doesn't it? It seems so deconstructive, but in the end, that's the world. That's somehow reality we live in. And yeah, that was also my experience. And I think the experience of many people who dive into that critical look also, and historical look onto yoga. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That's certainly the case here when we start to see how the context of contemporary yoga in places like Hawaii and America are influencing the practice and the aims of the practice as well. So yeah, that's very, very true. So it's a great summary of why it's important to continue to study contemporary forms of yoga. We are coming close to the end, so I'll take one more question here from Gayatri, who says, or perhaps we can see 1 minute. Okay, yes. In your perspective, can transnational yoga support an anti-capitalist and environmental future, or environmental just future? And if so, how? It's a big question, but in a minute, can you answer that one?
Yeah, okay, I'll try a minute. I'd like to think so, Gayatri. I mean, I found it in my own practice to be personally transformative, but then it requires so much structural change that it becomes difficult, because we're up against so many forces in society that we have no control over and that, try to squash us. But I think that, to help with these environmental issues, but I think on the individual level, it can be quite transformative if we stick to a particular system that has an ethical framework that calls into question the violence that we inflict on animals, the violence that we inflict on our air, as I've shown in chapter 3 of this book. And on our bodies. So I really think that there's a lot of hope, with regard to yoga. It certainly inspired me, and that's the way I teach it as well.
Do you feel the same, Laura? Do you feel there's hope for the future? Does yoga and the study of yoga from an intellectual perspective offer you hope for the future?
It does so, I think, yes. It's a good field to be in, to not get too desperate. Is there time for one last question, Chris? I think you might be even able to answer it quickly, or should I ask you in private?
No, go ahead. We have still a few minutes. We can run over a couple of minutes.
Oh, it's just because I'm asked that when you teach the history of yoga and so on, and people ask, so then what is tradition? So what is tradition? What would you answer?
What is tradition? I would say there are many. I always say there are many traditions, and they change. They don't remain the same. And yet there are some, if we take the quote unquote polythetic approach that I think Wendy Doniger comes up with, of saying that there are certain things about tradition and yoga tradition specifically that we can say make them a yoga tradition, for example. This notion that Chris Chappell, for example, wrote a long time ago, that it's some kind of subtilizing process that takes you from the gross to the subtle. So a tradition that does that, a tradition that is somehow concerned with an experience of higher consciousness. But I don't want to reify these as like the meaning of yoga or yoga tradition, but I think a lot of traditions share practices like this that take you from the outside world, your engagement with the outside world, your body, your breath, your mind, and then what's beyond the mind. And that's the kind of mystery and magic I try to leave open in the book. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting place to consider, actually, your subtitle, really, because eating, singing, and breathing are these subtle practices where we're transitioning from the outside to the inside, and in a very much an embodied way, as you say, because the food becomes us, doesn't it? Or the breath becomes us. So it's quite an interesting point to finish on. There were a couple of other questions, but we are right on time now. I'd like to finish with this anonymous attendee has asked, where can we buy the book in the UK? Routledge wants 130 Great British pounds, which is extraordinary. But I must note that you can buy the ebook online, and we did send out a 20% discount code. If you don't have that, please email me at the Centre of Yoga Studies at soas.ac.uk, and I can send through that discount code, so you should be able to buy that. Is it being put on the bookshelves anywhere, or should people just go directly to Routledge website?
I think the easiest way is on the Routledge website. The ebook is very affordable, as you say, with the discount and everything. And next year, there will be, probably at the end of next year or so, a South Asian paperback edition available in South Asia for much less than the 130 pounds. Sorry about Routledge's prices.
Thank you for making that accessible. That's brilliant. Yeah, so I've already got the ebook, which is makes it more affordable here in Australia. So I think we can end there, even though there's a couple more questions. I think we've covered quite a lot already this evening. And both of you, I'd like you to thank so much for your insights. Laura, specifically, I found your insight into Chris's book and your analysis of how it fits within the study of modern yoga really, really helpful. So thank you for that. Chris, it's so great to see your research coming to fulfillment after so many years, and to see this book take the shelves and take its place in modern yoga studies. To end this evening, I thought I'd just mention that our next event at the moment, we hope to have something between November and December. I'm just trying to firm up dates with somebody, but at the moment that's scheduled and open to book is the book launch of the Amaralga and the Amaralga Prabodha, the Genesis of Hatha and Raja Yoga, by Dr. Jason Birch, and we look forward to you joining us. It will be, at the moment, I've got the tickets on sale for the in-person event, and once a room is allocated, we hope to open tickets for the online version. So potentially it's going to be a hybrid event, so we hope you can all join us. But thank you all very much for your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much.
Thank you and good night.